Hey, fellow disruptors. Welcome back to the Disruption Podcast. I'm Michelle. My pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Tracy. My pronouns are she, they.
All right. So thank you all for coming back and listening. We've gotten some great feedback over the past, I would say, month or so that we've got a lot of diehard disruptors who are following us every couple weeks as we release new episodes. And so we're really glad that we're able to put out, some of this podcast content that people are really getting into. As always, and I'll ask again at the end of this episode, we'd love to hear what we're doing well as what we can do better so that we can keep delivering to you some of these really impactful, disruptive conversations with some of the phenomenal guests that we have in our world and our orbit that are doing amazing work in the space of disruption. So let me tell the listeners today, first and foremost, our discussion today is an important one. And it ties back to threads that we've had on some of our previous episodes, but very specifically today we'll discuss sexual violence and sexual assault. So, for any listeners who don't feel able to listen to this particular discussion involving these themes, you may skip this episode. Feel free to go back and listen to previous episodes that you've either listened to or may have missed, and join us in the next 2 weeks for our next disruptive conversation. Now, for those disruptors who are going to stay with us, we're really glad to have you in this conversation as we talk to a leading expert, advocate, and dare I say, warrior in the sexual violence and assault space about her disruption journey and the impactful work that she's doing to support survivors in navigating the critical spaces of healing and justice through the organization that she leads. What we know, just to kind of frame the topic, right? And we've talked about this before, but 1 in 3 women are victims of sexual or domestic violence in their lifetime. So, again, this topic and the ways that we can support survivors, each and every one of us are impacted, and it's really critically important for us to have these conversations. I know you're going to get a lot out of this particular guest and discussion. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce her to the rest of the pod, and then we'll dig into our conversation today. All right. So, as you can tell, I'm very excited today about the guest joining us. Her name is Tracy DeTomasi. She is the CEO of Callisto, a nonprofit with the mission of ending serial sexual assault one match at a time. Now, prior to Tracy's work with Callisto, she held leadership positions across the nonprofit sector over the past 20 plus years, where she has developed and implemented trauma informed programming and curricula. She was instrumental in changing domestic violence laws in the US and has worked on major impact projects globally. As a licensed clinical social worker, Tracy has extensive experience working in the field of gender based violence, giving her a deep understanding of the ecosystem of survivors, offenders, and allies. She has consulted with organizations to develop tech based tools, such as an app that educates users about violence against women, a smartphone device for sexual violence prevention safety, and virtual reality trainings to address diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti sexual harassment. Whew. So, Tracy,
Mhm.
welcome. We are so thrilled to have you and your expertise in conversation today, and just really looking forward to hearing you share your disruption journey with all of our fellow disruptors and digging into the ways in which we too can support you and what you're doing in this space.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here.
Yeah, and I guess I can talk a little bit about how I know Tracy. I mean, first of all, she has a great name. I mean, let's
It's
just
a
talk about
fantastic
that.
name.
I mean, we have the same name. That's a positive thing. I love it. But I met Tracy back when I was at Uber. And she was working for one of the national nonprofits, no more at the time, that we were partnering with. And so she was a joy to work with, fantastic work that she did in partnership with us. And now I get to sit on the board of Callisto and help support the organization and everything she's doing. So excited to have her because she's such an all-star as an individual, but also for her to be able to come on and talk about this really important platform that is instrumental in our communities. So first of all, we always start our podcast with talking about disruption. So Tracy, tell us what disruption means to you.
Yeah, being one of the avid listeners of your show, I always love people's answers to this question, and it made me really kind of think about what does disruption mean to me. And when I thought kind of about my disruption journey, what I really thought is that it's about creating really intentional moments that allows ourselves and others to really question our own beliefs and actions, and that way we can really determine if they're effective. And when I say effective, I mean in increasing love and kindness and decreasing hate and oppression. And that's really what it comes down to. And I think that sometimes we have this thought that disruption is this really big thing, but I think that disruption is really about disrupting those thoughts and those behaviors that we do our own selves that we don't always think about. And I try to really work to find those really intentional moments to disrupt people's thoughts and feelings in a really kind and compassionate way.
Mm. I love that. Such an important message. And then for ourselves, thinking about how we can disrupt those limiting thoughts also that sometimes plague us to do more
Mm-hmm.
in the space. So,
I love
um,
the idea too, just to jump in, like about
mhm,
how, starting internal, right, has these ripple effects, right? It's almost kind of the concept that I think we hear a lot these days too around starting local and how that can really turn into, such global impact. I think that's a beautiful concept of disruption. And it makes this, I think, idea of how can we all get involved so much more accessible, right? When we all
Yeah.
think about what, our power is, and to Tracy's point, really trying to get away from limiting thoughts, it still can be kind of difficult, right? To find that power and permission to jump in. But so I love the idea of changing your own mind frame, and it can change the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that, there's a lot of people that want to enter the space. And having done this work well before Me Too ever happened, um, people just didn't really know how to enter it. And
Mhm.
I think that, but we need more people to enter it and we need to be more welcoming. And I think that that is the thing is that disruption it has to be internal first. We have to check our own selves first. And I know I've learned a lot of lessons and I've failed and I've made a lot of mistakes and, you know, um, but it was necessary for me to look internally because if I don't do that, then I can't help anybody else either.
yeah.
Yep.
So true. That is the most important part. We can't really help others until we really, focus on ourselves and prioritizing ourselves and our own self awareness, and also just at times, as you said, correcting ourselves or educating ourselves. So important in that space. So let's talk a little bit about your passion. What I know about you, also about the platform Callisto, and I know that there's been a focus on sexual assault that occurs on college campuses and in institutions of higher education. Where does your passion for that particular space come from?
I think that if we can disrupt and make those changes when people are at the young, impressionable college age, we change their futures. Sexual violence plays such an impact on, for the victims. If they've been assaulted in college, many of them drop out, many of them change their careers. And so if we can get that at such a young age, and there is a difference between over 18 and under 18, as far as how we address these. And so if we can get it at the youngest age as you are an adult, I think that it can just make such a huge difference. And it really shapes the culture. Like we can see how Gen Z is doing things so much differently than Gen Xers like me. And if we can prevent them from having this story as part of their story and change the culture, it's going to change generations to come. And sexual
Mhm.
violence impacts everybody at some level. And eventually we would love to get beyond this space. But right now, I think that changing that and changing the offenders who don't then go on to enter into careers and sexually harass people in their careers and do worse things beyond college. And if we can um, make an impact when the offenders are in college too, that's also changing the amount of victims that they have over their lifespan.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so kind of focusing then on, I know where a lot of Callisto's mission is, and a lot of, as you've described, where your passion is. We did gather some statistics, and so I'd love to be able to share those with our listeners, and yeah, really kind of dig into, Tracy, the work you're doing, and then your thoughts on exactly what you've just framed, right? How do we really get to the root of this concern at such a young adult age so that we can positively impact lives moving forward, right? On both sides, I guess I would say, of the situation or the event. And feel free, to throw in some of your own information. I know you're certainly well read, and well statisticked, if that's a word, on a lot of this. But what I found is, that basically we've got estimates, right, regarding sexual assault impact on students during their college years. So what I found is that that we've got 1 in 4 female students who are victims or survivors of sexual assault during college. 1 in 15 male students, which I think often there's maybe, kind of an assumption, right, of, of where the assault occurs, or kind of certainly more common among women, but I think it's really important to note, right, that 1 in 15 male students experience this impact as well. And then 1 in 5 transgender, non-binary, or genderqueer students are victims or survivors of sexual assault during their college years. Furthermore, what statistics show are that over 90% of these assaults are committed by repeat perpetrators. And I found that it's often these folks who offend an average 6 times before they graduate. And to me, that just blew me away. So I think there's a real thread of conversation we can probably have there. Just to round out what we pulled together, less than 10% of student survivors ever report their assault. And I think, obviously that really means, right, that these, repeat perpetrators, as we've just teed up, tend to go undetected and face virtually no deterrent effects, right? Or no, no prosecution, no impact that would deter them from committing future crimes. And then finally, I found that only 25.25% of assaults result in a form of arrest, felony conviction, or incarceration of the actual perpetrator. So to me, right, a lot of numbers that are real people. These are not numbers; these are people. These are impacts, and I think it really frames the depth of this concern and issue when we focus on college campuses and institutions of higher education. So I wanted to tee that up for our listeners, right, to really frame out what this, what the impact is, what the topic, looks like amongst all the people that are impacted. Like, what are some of your thoughts when you hear those statistics? I anticipate statistics that, you've heard before and really work with every day.
Yeah, when I started my career as a social worker, 20 plus years ago, I was actually a certified therapist for adolescent sex offenders. And that's where I started my career. And most of my youngest client was 6 years old. And, I worked with youth and young adults up to about 22. And every one of them had at least 5, 6, 7 victims, and most of those were not known until they got into therapy, until they got into treatment. But the other thing, and I haven't kept up with these statistics, but at the time it was about a 5 to 15% recidivism rate with treatment. Mm-hmm. And so one of those things that the statistics tell me is that those 1 in 4, 1 in 5, 1 in 15, those numbers haven't changed much over the years. And I really think that those numbers are probably worse because this is such an underreported crime, and how we find those numbers can be really difficult because there's surveys and there's, how are they surveying these? Because a lot of people don't, the same people who report that they have been, had sex without consent also report that they haven't been raped. And it's this definition thing, and it comes to shame and all of that. So these numbers are tragic. But like you said, they're people. And they're people who've experienced this, and we need to find a new solution, which I'm hoping that Callisto is one of the solutions to really impact these numbers. And the numbers really need to go up before they go down, especially when it comes to official reports, because like you said, less than 10% of people report to authorities. And those numbers really have to go up, and that's when we know we're making a difference, because these systems aren't safe for people to report to right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and the other thing that we should mention is that these statistics are beyond college age, right? They're
Yeah.
beyond the adolescence. Like this is the number that impacts all ages. And it is, it's horrific that these numbers are what they are. And yes, they probably are because they're underreported much higher. Um, Tracy, what are some of the specific trends that really differentiate maybe the college age group? Are there any specific trends that you're seeing now? And I even think about, how dating has changed. Working in the dating industry now, a lot of people are meeting on dating apps, and they're meeting their suspects. The people who commit these crimes. They're connecting with people on things like social media and dating apps. But is there anything specific that you've seen around, whether it's reporting, whether it's the actual incidents? Is there anything specific trends around college age?
Well, I think though it's not necessarily fully unique, but I think that around college age, there's a lot of experimentation and there's a lot of, you know, people who are, these young adults who are free for the first time. And yet their brains are not fully developed, And so I think that there's a lot of risk taking behavior. There's a lot of changes that the first time that they've left the house, particularly now with so many people that age having been impacted by the pandemic, and not having that same socialization. But I think that, drugs and alcohol in colleges and the binge drinking culture that we have in colleges really impacts college sexual assault. And not to say that that is the only, that all the sexual assaults on college campuses involve alcohol or drugs, because I don't think that it does. And I think that it's changed among, over the years. But I do think that there is such an impact because it makes victims question whether or not they were assaulted. So maybe they started drinking at a party and they wanted to make out with another person, but they didn't want to have sex with that other person. But now they feel guilty for that happening, and they don't identify it as sexual assault because they wanted the first part of it, but not the second part of it, and it is sexual assault if they didn't consent. And that's the issue. But I do think that with social media and all of that, there is a level of safety in that too, because there's more knowledge about sexual assault. I remember going to college, in the late 90s and being given a rape whistle. And it was a whistle,
Yeah.
and it was, I assume what was the rape crisis center. I don't even know. And you were supposed to carry that whistle and you were supposed to blow it if somebody came up and raped you. And that was like the solution.
Yeah.
And I think that technology has changed that with like smartphones and GPS tracking. And I think that some students are talking about that. But until we really start to improve our sex education across the board, we're not going to get there enough. And if students get a hold of the wrong information, it also increases those myths as well. But yeah, I mean, I still think that as far as the trends go, I mean, I think that it's not that much different than it's always been. But because college students are still exploring who they are sexually and otherwise, that it just gets really a gray area. And then they think that, well, I thought sexual assault was, a man coming up from behind the bushes or from a parking garage and attacking me. And it's not. I think it's 90% of students know their perpetrator. And they can find them on social media, which is why our platform works. And I think that that's starting to be talked about a little bit more, but definitely not enough.
Yeah.
I remember, probably very little. There are probably plenty of reasons why college was a bit fuzzy for me. But I don't recall, and I went to a major university, state university, state funded, et cetera. I don't recall, Tracy, frankly, if any significant education, right, around definitions as you've discussed, and specifically like what does consent look like, even in situations where, you're out having a good time and maybe not making, good decisions with regard to substances. Do you see in your experience that, universities and these campuses are starting to take a proactive approach, or maybe starting is not the best word, but increasingly taking any kind of proactive approach to education? Is there, do you see funding that's being put around this? I mean, how hard is it to reach these students with this kind of education?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there is more, attempts at education, but there's also a part where kids are going to be kids,
Sure.
and this age is going to be this age, and they're going to experiment and they're going to do that. And so, like, my opinion would be to do more harm reduction and really meeting students in that age where they're at. Of okay, so you're going to drink, know the risks. But I think that part of the issue that the education isn't focused on, it's the education has been focused on how not to get raped. The education isn't focused on how not to rape. And I
Mm.
think that is the key. And I think that there
Hmm.
are a couple of places that are starting to do that, but that is not common. And I think that we have done a much better job throughout the generations of educating, young women and a lot of LGBTQ folks too about how to stay safe. But really that comes to reducing your own risk. So I think everybody knows cover your drink when you're at a bar. Everybody knows that that's something that you should do. But that's not preventing sexual assault. That's reducing your own individual risk of sexual assault,
Hmm.
because that person, that offender, is just going to assault somebody else. They're just going to put the drug in somebody else's drink or buy somebody else more alcohol. And so that's really not changing the problem. It's reducing your own individual risk. And I think that that is where we're still failing students. Is we've done we've done a much better job of educating women and trans and non-binary folks, but we haven't done a good job of identifying men and how do we teach them about sexual assault, because they're actually more likely to be sexually assaulted in college than they are to be falsely accused. And yet that's the conversation is
Mm.
around false accusations. And I think that there is a gray area of sexual assault that we don't talk about either. There is the perpetrator and then there's the predator. There is the person
Hmm.
who didn't get consent and sexually assaulted somebody. And that experience for the victim is tragic and traumatic and all the things. But the experience of the offender is that some of those offenders, you can just say, did you know that this was a problem? And as soon as they hear that, it changes how they interact because they just didn't have the information. Then of course you have the predators who are looking for power and control, and they're looking for all of that, but so much of the resources are going on to help, as they should definitely help victims and survivors, of course, and I don't want to suggest otherwise, but I do think that we need to really start approaching sexual assault education from a much different perspective, and that is about how to gain consent, and particularly how boys and young adults can gain consent, and what sex looks like and what not consenting looks like. Because I think that so many people think, oh well, if the other person just says no, or you know then I know. But what about if they just freeze? If we think about trauma
Hmm.
responses, they think that like, oh, they're going to kick, they're going to scream if I'm raping them. But the main trauma response is freezing.
Yeah.
And so you're frozen, and do you know that that means that you didn't get consent and that you're violating
Yeah.
somebody? And I don't think that we talk about that enough.
Mhm.
Mm.
Mm.
I think that's
Such a
such an important point. I will say I have also, I think, spoken, not necessarily on this podcast, but in various conversations about exactly what you're suggesting, right, as a focus for this kind of education and approach, in a different way to solve or impact this issue. So I couldn't agree more.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think this is a good place to define consent. Can you define consent for our listeners?
Um, sure. I mean, I think that the main thing that I think consent should be enthusiastic, that both parties are enthusiastically agreeing to every piece that they're engaging in a sexual manner. And obviously, consent can go beyond sex, but that they fully agree with capacity, with agency over their bodies of every piece that they are involved in. So maybe they consent to making out, um, but they don't consent to sex. Or maybe they consent to oral sex, but they don't consent to vaginal penetration or anal penetration. And it's really about getting enthusiastic consent. So that you really know that both parties are excited about it, and that just makes sex better. In the end, that just makes sex better.
Yeah. And I think the other thing to add there is that it can always be withdrawn. Maybe
Yes.
you wanted those things in the beginning, and as it's progressing, you decide you don't want it. So all of a sudden, it doesn't become enthusiastic anymore,
Yeah.
or the consent is withdrawn. So I think it's important to also mention that.
Agreed.
Thank
Yep.
you.
So another thing that I picked up on, and certainly in understanding, the Callisto platform and what that platform is really driving to do, is focusing again back on the ability of the survivor to make a report, right? Or kind of what that space looks like for that individual to be able to come forward. I think in support, often in healing of themselves, but also in potentially an attempt to try and highlight a perpetrator so that it doesn't happen to other people. Can you talk to us a little bit about just again how you frame the difficulty in the survivor coming forward, and I think what you've done with Callisto in order to provide a platform that can make that a more accessible, and I hate to say easier, right, but a more viable option.
Yeah, there's so many issues with survivors coming forward and reporting to authorities. The systems that, either the criminal justice system, the civil justice system, or, Title IX, those systems are rooted in white supremacy. They're rooted in the patriarchy, and they're not designed for a lot of people that are experiencing the highest levels of harm. 25% of women who report any type of gender-based violence to the police report being threatened or getting arrested for reporting that type of gender-based violence. And so, when we hear stories like that and we see those statistics and we know people who've experienced that thing, other people don't want to report. The system is often really re-traumatizes victims and survivors as well. It takes a long time. One of the things I always say is that we think that reporting is like an episode of Law and Order SVU, and it's not. There's no team of people that have access to all the information and that they can call somebody and they can just slap the keyboard a little bit and then they pull up all these databases and all the databases are connected. That doesn't actually happen. For a lot of different reasons, for underfunding, for lack of resources, for all of that, for education, for law enforcement, for education of other people in the system. But it's really traumatic to report. When people report to Title IX, which is basically the federal statute about how colleges and educational places in general have to deal with sexual assault, reports of sexual assault on campuses. The guidance changes with every administration. Every school has a little bit of a different take on what it means. And if the perpetrator doesn't attend the same school, they don't have a Title IX case. So a lot of those things, even if the systems want to help, they can't. And there's a lot of limitations in that. And so we need a different way. We need to make it safer to report and safer to connect survivors, because the two things that in the 20 years that I've done this, the two most common things that I hear when somebody tells me that they're a survivor is, I thought I was alone. And the second thing was, I reported because I didn't want him to do it to somebody else, or I feel guilty for not reporting because I always wondered if he did it to somebody else. And, when I tell people about what we're doing at Callisto, I always get a pause. And as soon as I get a pause, I know the next sentence is going to be, I wish I had that when I was in college.
Oh.
Because it's so pervasive.
That's so powerful.
Well, that's a great segue into talking about Callisto and what Callisto is. And if you could talk to us, Tracy, a little bit about how, the mission behind Callisto and how you really see it bringing hope and healing and justice for survivors.
Yeah, so we have created a platform called Callisto Vault, and it has two parts of the system. The main part is the matching system, but it also has the encrypted record form. And the matching system is this really unique way, and it's all completely encrypted. It's actually double encrypted. We don't have access to the information in the system, but how it works is that survivors can log into it, and they can they put in the state in which the assault occurred, and which is because the sexual assault laws and definitions vary from state to state. And then they put in the unique identifier of a perpetrator. So that's a social media handle, an email address, or a phone number. And we do that rather than a name because there are a million John Smiths in the world. You know, a name isn't unique enough, and that would get to too many false reports and not enough accurate matches. So when somebody else puts in that same unique identifier, there's a match. And I'll talk about that in a second. But the third step about entering the information is to consent to being contacted by a legal options counselor. And a legal options counselor is an attorney that is free to the survivor, and they help walk through the options that they have. They don't represent them in court, but this is what it would be like to go through a criminal process. This is what it's like to go through a civil process. What questions do you have about this? You know, these are the legal ramifications if you're going to blast the perpetrator on social media, and any of the questions that a survivor may want to know. And then after there's a match that occurs, both survivors are connected with their own legal options counselors who meet with them, talk to them about that. And then if it's safe to do so, they connect. The legal options counselors connect the survivors. And that's really important, that it's safe to do so. If it impacts their legal case, they don't connect them. But there is such a power in knowing that you weren't the only one, particularly from the same perpetrator, and knowing that there's more power in numbers, and that you get to decide together of what to report, or maybe just confronting that person, or holding them accountable, or getting them out of a fraternity, or out of a athletic team, or out of a club, or something like that, that may not require Title IX, or may not require police involvement at all. And it's that connection, and that safely connection is the important piece, because in the Me Too movement, we saw that happening, but we saw journalists doing that a lot of the times. Mm-hmm. And there's the confidentiality issues, the fact that a journalist has to be interested in the case, and that the perpetrator has to be somebody of influence in order to even make it into the news. Or the survivors had the option to blast it on social media and hope that somebody else saw it without getting accused of defamation, or saying that they falsely accused somebody outside of the system. And that's really the power of Callisto, is making those connections and making people feel alone. And we put it all back in the hands of the survivor, and the control back in the hands of survivors. So we don't go through and prosecute offenders. That's not our job. Our job is to give the survivors the information that they need so they can make the choices that are best for them. We would never want somebody to go through a criminal court proceeding if they're not ready to do that, because that can be so traumatizing for them. And so we're not a reporting tool. The other question that we get asked a lot is, oh, so can we just look up the perpetrator information? And that's also no. We don't have access to that information because we take security so seriously. And the only people that have access to that information are the legal options counselors, and that's protected under attorney-client privilege. So it's all really rooted in confidentiality and safety and security, and making sure that the survivor has the information that they need to make the decision that's best for them.
And what has been some of the responses that you've heard from people actually utilizing this tool from the survivors? Like, what's some real feedback that you've heard, good, and feedback that you've also maybe taken that feedback and incorporated to make improvements in Callisto? But yeah, what has been the overwhelming response?
Mm-hmm. You know, the interesting thing is, so because we don't have access to the name of the survivors, we haven't been able to get feedback directly from them. We're working on a really secure way to do that confidentially. But I can tell you, some of the things that we've heard from some of our Callisto ambassadors who are volunteers and their students on campus that spread the word about Callisto. And they're really excited that there's another option. They're excited that they have a different system that they trust, that they're in control of, that is secure, that they can connect with other survivors. And we know that speaking to some of the legal options counselors with a little bit of information that they can share with us with maintaining that privileged information, is that sometimes some of the cases that are matching wouldn't probably elevate to the level of a criminal sexual assault, but it doesn't mean that it's not a violation. And I think that that is really key as well, because there's a lot of sexual assaults that happen that aren't going to, like, that police aren't going to be able to do anything with. And it doesn't mean that there can't be a different solution for those individuals, especially toward when it goes to healing. And those individuals also get traumatized a lot of the times if they do go to report to police, and the police like, there's nothing we can do. And I think that there is a really unique opportunity to be able to help folks who those systems can't help. I also think that one of the things that I'm starting to hear a little bit more, and not necessarily from survivors that are using our platform, but the folks that are really excited about our platform on college campuses, and that is the help that we can give to men. Because, you know, a lot of times the resources for sexual assault are in women's centers on college. And men don't have access to those, or the language is very gendered around it. And so men don't see themselves in it, or men don't identify that this hazing ritual was actually sexual assault, or that this coach that they loved and is well respected could actually sexually assault somebody. Or there's a level of homophobia that happens of, I was assaulted, you know, a man was assaulted by another man, and what do I do with that information? And how do I deal with that? Because again, a level of homophobia. And so I think that this is also going to give voice to young men who haven't been represented in this conversation. And I think that that will change responses to violence against women as well in the future. But I think that this will really be able to help identify so many people that haven't had a voice and haven't ever used their voice, because they can go into the system, put in their information, and then leave it. And that before, maybe they wouldn't tell anybody about it. I mean, the amount of people that have told me over the years, like, I've never actually disclosed that I'm a survivor until I talk to you. And they can still not disclose that they're a survivor, but they still have a way to do that, and know that they're not the only one, and potentially match with somebody else.
Yeah. I love hearing you talk about the opportunity that Callisto provides to really, provide, educational support for men who are survivors. It seems to me like that can really then flow into the other point you were making, right? Where, there's a lot of work to be done in teaching, and I hate to just say men, right? I think men are probably predominantly who we see as perpetrators, but not always.
99% of perpetrators are men.
Okay, generally speaking, right? In teaching men how not to rape and how not to sexually assault. Like, it just seems like when you can arm a community of men who may be survivors, right, with knowledge, that may be an easier opportunity to then teach that same community on the side of the perpetrator or a potential perpetrator, kind of what not to do, if that makes sense, right? Like, kind of maybe a little easier adoption hearing from somebody, in your community or in your gender, rather than maybe hearing from a woman, trying to describe to men how not to be the perpetrator. So it seems like there's a lot of good synergy there that can really make headway in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, and I think it's good too. And I think this is important in asking that question, is to understand just how much information also you have access to, not only from experts, but that you're hearing from college campuses. And having those, those champions, who I would call them champions, who are on those college campuses, really educating and raising awareness around Callisto. Is a lot of times you're going to get direct information from the actual students who are engaging with folks around different tools like this. And the more options that people have, the better. You are putting the autonomy with the victim and survivor to be able to have more choices and more options that they, without Callisto, may have not had those options available to them.
Yeah. And I think that, the other thing is that if somebody has reported to the police or has reported to Title IX, they can still use Callisto because maybe they can find other people to help support their case. And maybe they came forward because they were privileged enough to do so. And now they can help somebody who's less privileged and is more afraid to go to those, to go to police or to go to Title IX, or didn't know that those resources were really even available. And that can help too. And so it's just really about building a case. And, we don't want to replace these systems. We want to help support them and be an alternative for people who aren't using those systems. Because like we said, I think it's 6% of students report, so on college campuses, like about 6% of students report if they've been sexually assaulted to Title IX or to police. So there's 94% of students who've been sexually assaulted that aren't doing anything with it. Maybe talking to their friends, maybe talking to a counselor, but they're not even using those systems. But we're hoping that they're using our system to be able to have access to those other systems and to start to trust those other systems as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to hear, and really, I think, provides a lot of hope to hear. I think since Callisto campus has been an option, what the increase has looked like in reporting. And so just interested if you can tell us a little bit more about your point that you made earlier, which is in order to see the numbers, the real impact numbers go down, we need to see, the way I took it at least, right, these reported numbers or reported incidents go up. So where do you, or help our listeners understand where we find value, right, in seeing those reporting numbers increase so that we can, tackle the problem?
When we get to more of a 90% reporting rate versus a 6% reporting rate, we can actually figure out what the problem is and what the solution is. And right now the problem is reporting. And so we have to figure out different ways to help people report. And I think the statistic is it takes about 11 months for a survivor from the time the assault to decide to report. And so it's 11 months that they're sitting with that. Do I report? Do I not report? Do I report? Do I not report? What are the benefits? What are the harms? What am I worried about? What's going to be the blowback to me? And so I think that if we can get those reporting numbers to be more accurate, then we can start to see a decrease in some of the solutions that we have put forward. And I think that is the nature of what Callisto can do, is it can help people get to those reporting places in an easier way, because they feel like that they have more support in doing that. And unfortunately, we know that there's strength in numbers. We can see Me Too. We can see that, how many survivors reported Larry Nassar before he was held accountable, and how many times did the police not find, investigated, and it just went nowhere, and that Michigan State University found him innocent. I don't know if innocent's the right word, but said that they didn't hold him accountable.
Unsubstantiated, or whatever whatever that terminology
there you go.
is.
Whatever the word is. I think there's a OBGYN at USC that is going through that now, who has hundreds of victims. There's a former coach from U of M who assaulted numerous male athletes at U of M from the 60s into the 90s, that is finally being held accountable. Even though he's passed away, the school is being held accountable for sweeping a lot of that under the rug, because people have reported. I think that with the Me Too movement, we heard, well, we're listening to the voices of survivors. The survivors' voices have always been loud. Maybe not everybody's voice, but there have been survivors' voices that have been loud, and we have refused to listen to them. And we have actively, as a society, silenced them. And that's the issue. And when we get that reporting number up, where we can look at those crime statistics, that's when we know that survivors really have a voice, and that people are listening to the voice, because survivors have that voice now. People just aren't listening.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about, and talking about this and wanting to really see those numbers get up, is if there's somebody listening who is on a college campus or attending a college campus, and they're wondering, like, is this at my college campus? Can I do this? How do I access Callisto? How do I learn more? What is the best way for somebody to find out more about Callisto if they are a survivor or victim?
Mm-hmm. The easiest way is to go to our website, which is projectcallisto.org. Right now, about 40 schools across the US have access to Callisto Vault, and anybody with that .edu address at that school has access. So even if you're a professor or a faculty member, you would have access as well. And we are working very hard to raise money this summer to launch to all campuses in the US by the fall. So we're hoping right now to launch all of that in October. So keep checking our website to see if we release it to more college campuses before then. But that we really want to launch to anybody with a .edu address by the fall. And that would be, there's no cost to the school. There's no cost to the survivor. We rely on really amazing donors and philanthropic funding to really provide these services for free. And so by the end of 2023, anybody with a .edu address will be able to report. And we know that people want access right now. We have an overwhelming demand for it, and we want to make sure that everything is up and running the way it needs to be before we fully scale that.
Mm. Yeah, that would be awesome to achieve that goal by the end of 2023, to be able to access this on any campus with that EDU. So it sounds like what people can do, particularly whether they're on campus or they're just hearing about this, or they have kids who are attending college, or they just want to be a part of it, that funding is an essential need. And I'm assuming they are in helping raise awareness about the funding. So is there also information about that on the website that they can access?
Yep, there is a donate button on the website. You can also go to give.projectcallisto.org and create your own fundraiser for us to really support this growth, to make sure that we are on all campuses by the fall, which is really important. We are having some live demos, so check our website for live demos if you really want a demonstration and to how easy it is to enter into matching. We are also creating some programming and webinars about how parents can respond if they know that their child has been sexually assaulted, because really the way somebody receives feedback when they tell their story for the first time is going to change the impact and the trajectory of how they hold that trauma for the rest of their life. And so if they tell their parent, how their parent responds is going to change the trajectory of how they hold that trauma. And so we want to really prepare parents, because most parents don't want to think about it. They don't expect that to happen to their child, and don't always respond very well when their child says that they've been sexually assaulted in college. And there's a lot of victim blaming that can happen. Well, were you drinking? What were you wearing? I told you not to party, all of those things, but all of those have a really negative impact. And really just holding space for a survivor and making sure it's about their reaction and not yours is the important part. So we're doing more webinars to really help parents understand that. And so keep checking back at our website. You can also follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Callisto, and on Facebook at Callisto.org. And so we're really active there as well, of giving information about our platform, also information about how trauma impacts sexual assault survivors in new and different ways that a lot of other places aren't talking about. So.
Love it. This is a lot of good information that we really want to get out there, and we'll do everything we can as well to raise awareness about it. And we're so grateful for the conversation with you, Tracy. I can't tell you how grateful I am for the work that you've done just as an individual and dedicating your life to this space for a long time now, and then working with an organization that's doing such meaningful work. So we want to thank you for joining us, for having this conversation with us. And this is all on behalf of survivors and trying to help them achieve the healing, the support, and the justice they deserve. And Callisto is very much at the heart of doing that. It's just, it's an honor for me to always have conversations with you, but to also be a part of helping Callisto continue to elevate and help more and more survivors out there.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. A couple years ago, one survivor said that at least one person in every friend group needs to know about Callisto. And
Mm.
being on a podcast like this with people who are really interested in this topic and interested in disrupting things like sexual violence, it really helps us spread the word. And, Tracy, for your leadership on our board, when I reached out to you and asked you to be on the board, I was just beyond thrilled that you actually said yes. And so thank you for being a partner in that, because it's just going to make our organization stronger and better, and to really make a significant impact. So thank you for letting me come on here and talk about Callisto, and thank you for your ongoing leadership and support of our organization.
Thank you.
Well, I have to echo Tracy's sentiments to you, Tracy. In just, I can't imagine the kind of dedication, and just real energy it takes to be in a space like this for as long as you have, and to be such an instrumental role model and leader for so many folks who do want to jump in and disrupt, sexual violence and the impact that it has on so many, especially in that kind of youth phase, right? So I applaud you in your work, and I think Callisto is such an important organization and platform. I will take it as certainly one of my go forward calls to action, that at least, I will be the person in all of my friend groups, and whatever those groups, kind of look like, or the reasons we're coming together to make sure that I am, speaking about Callisto and the great work you're doing. And so certainly from a podcast perspective, we are going to be sure to give our fellow disruptors all the information so that they can access Callisto's website and learn more about the organization. Hit that donate button, of course, if you're so inclined. And also, Tracy, your personal socials and Callisto's socials so they can follow there too. We're really appreciative of all of the fellow disruptors who've joined us in this conversation, and we have no doubts that you two will take, all of this good information on to make sure that your friend groups are aware of Callisto and that we're all doing our part to impact this space of sexual violence. And certainly we'll be back, as always, in another 2 weeks with more disruptive conversations. So for everyone listening, we couldn't tell you how much we appreciate this community that we've created. And we hope that you're really enjoying, the impact and information that we're able to share with you during these conversations. You can always find us, as can any of your friends, family, and fellows, on Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. As always, we'd love to hear from you. So if you liked us, we'll take a 5-star rating and review. And certainly we're also want to hear some feedback on what we can do differently or better. So let us hear from you, and keep getting out there and disrupting.
I've never heard, by the way, the term friend group. So is that like a mom? Is that like a 40-something word, like friend groups? I'm going to tell all my friend groups.
I don't know.
I'm just saying, I know I have like different pockets, like I'm a multifaceted person. I got this group, I got that group, and maybe there's like a Venn diagram, but I don't know.
Just like, do all the Gen Zers in college age right now use friend groups? I mean, you might have to define what. I love it. I love it.
I guarantee you that absolutely dates me. And so you're welcome to everyone listening who needs to giggle at, the old lady in the room. That's fine.
Yeah. Hey, we're all over 40 on this podcast, but looking good. So,
That's right. Head on over to YouTube and you too can confirm that for yourself.
Well, that comes to the very end where I, get to do a call to action, and I get to do that call to action along with you, Tracy. So they get a double Tracy call to action today. What would you like to leave listeners with as far as a call to action?
I think the call to action is twofold. First of all, is that continue to have conversations about sexual assault with your friend group and beyond your friend group, but really continue to have these conversations because it's really important, and to educate yourself in order to learn how to disrupt better. And the second thing is to donate. With your help and your support, we can actually make this a reality of getting onto every college campus. We're scaling from 40 schools to 4,000 schools. And so that's a big jump. And so every dollar helps. And so please donate what you can.
Love it. Yes, please do donate because this is definitely a meaningful tool that we need on every college campus. So for me, calling all champions and disruptors, let's assemble and let's convene. This is the Disruption Podcast, podcast about activating big, bold change. Are you ready to disrupt? Here we go.